Okay, so hi again. This is the first official episode of the podcast prior to, or sorry, after the introduction episode thing. This episode, we will be focusing on the impact of law on assistive technology in the field of special education. So, I'm gonna give like a brief overview of like the topics that I want to hit within like this episode. So so starting off, roughly, I want to talk about policies and policy makers, um, and just so like we as like people have like a good overview as to like what it's like for people who make policies or like why policies are the way they are or the way that they're worded. Um, Next, I'm going to talk about the Assistive Technology Act of 2004. Um, I will talk about it a bit more, but there are goals within that law or that act that I really want to talk about. I want to talk about my personal experience with my own like familial experience, but also within my own career experience with the like technically this act or these policies within this law setting. Um, I also want to talk about IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I'm going to talk a bit more of what that means when it comes to assistive technology. So I would be reading a bit more. I'll also talk about like how parents can use that, and if they feel like their child is like eligible for like that type of thing. So yeah. So going back, I want to talk about policymakers. So I always find that it's extremely important to acknowledge that policymakers walk a very tightrope between being very specific and being very vague. Like they have to be specific enough that it can apply to so many different angles of just one broad issue, but is specific enough that it can apply to anyone. So interpretation of policies can be applicable to a lot of different people. Um, this is really hard. They have to balance this like, wow, we need to be specific, but we can't be too specific enough that people can't get what they need. But we can't be too vague that it applies to too many people and too many people are getting resources that aren't necessarily useful for them. So having these like specific criterias in these policies is important, but I wanted to just acknowledge the fact that policy making is extremely difficult. But yeah, next I want to talk about is the fact that like the Assistive Technology Act of 2004. So this is a traditional, like, it continues the traditions from a prior act called the Tech Acts. Um, this law or act from 2004, its goals were to increase the availability of funding for access and provisions of and training about assistive technology devices as well as services. So within this act, they have goals, or like what they hope to achieve within this law. So, for example, the first one is to increase the use of assistive technology in transition from one program to another. So, for example, thinking about this in terms of like education, so how one teacher, the year that the student is using, say, an assistive technology device like a communication tablet or a speech to text or a text to speech device, that teacher had been trained to help the student use and facilitate and like use this to the best advantage that they can within classes. So that transition period from that current class to their future class, that new teacher is going to have to be trained. They're going to need to understand and talk to the teacher prior to be like, hey, how did this work for the student? Was there things that could be changed, that could be worked on, that could help facilitate what the student needs better? Um, so that's just one of the ways that this act is hoping to like achieve. The next is to increase the involvement of individuals and their families in the process of decision making. So parents obviously understand that what their what their child needs just a tad bit more in terms of like a personal level, especially outside of the classroom. Teachers, don't get me wrong, we see what students need in terms of how to communicate with their peers, how to communicate their needs in a classroom environment, in a lunchroom setting, in all these different environments in a school building. You don't see it out in public, like how they interact with others and like how it impacts their just daily day-to-day communication, what they need, what's happening at home, how to voice concerns, opinions, and stuff like that. So having individuals and families be a part of the decision making as to what devices will benefit the student um, increases the actual like correct or like most useful device that would be beneficial for a student who needs assistive technology. Um, I think that it's important to have like families in this process because they just know a bit more and they want to learn how to advocate for their child and how to teach their child to advocate for themselves in future like settings once they're in no longer in a school environment. Next is to increase the capacity of public agencies to provide and pay for assistive technology. Assistive technology is extremely like expensive, and it's important to acknowledge that. So we need to think about this in terms of like a community-based like need. So if the public is more like understanding as to like what assistive technology is and how we can even like doing low tech like assistive technology in a public setting would benefit others. For example, like in a coffee shop, having like a little decision board or like options that they can point at instead of having to point up at like something behind them, like a cashier behind them. The cashier has a turn, no longer is facing the person, stuff like that. Next is the increase of coordination among agencies to provide and pay for assistive technology. So this is more in a private setting, more for like schools paying for devices for children to use, or bigger agencies like policy, like insurances and whatnot, to be using like and paying for these like devices. Next is to facilitate change in assistive technology laws and policies because it's such a new and constantly changing thing that this always just needs to be updated. It's just one of those things that you can't leave and be like, one and done, we're over, it's finished. No, it's constantly changing. It needs to be reworked, revamped every so often, even every year, if that, because new technology is constantly coming out. And we as a society need to understand how can we best help students and how can we best help people who use these devices, and how can future technologies be used to be helpful for others. And then another thing is to increase awareness and knowledge about the benefits of assistive technology, because some people don't even realize that they may benefit from assistive technology. They might think, I don't need it. Like sometimes you need that little extra help, even if it's not like constantly. Being aware of how helpful it is to other people who constantly use it is extremely important. Just having awareness to a situation brings eye-opening and very sympathetic and empathetic understandings from others, especially in public. There would be less judgmental like issue like things. It would be extremely beneficial. This act is both for state and national projects. So it's not only on like a national level of like an overall, okay, this is for the country. No, it's also for states, like very specific to states. States will delegate as necessary funding and everything like that. I wanted to talk about IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So how this is used in assistive technology is more often in section 504 or 504. 504 does not provide funds to states to assist in complying with acts as IDEA does. It's hard to understand, I know. It's very complex. Laws are extremely complex. But so services and provisions are enforced by IDEA, but having a clearer and more accessible understanding is more in the section is more an idea than in the section 504. 504 is just a brief overview, whereas idea is specifically for an individual. Um, so yes, it needs to be under. The student must have a disability that is covered by the criteria in one of the 13 specific eligible categories. Yes, but how can be done is if parents believe that like his or her child has one of the disabilities specified in those like criterias, um, they can request an evaluation. They have to request an evaluation through the principal, which is extremely difficult. It can be challenging. From a personal experience, I know from my brother, who is hard of hearing, from a personal experience, how hard it is to get resources in schools, especially public schools. Private schools are even more difficult because they're not government funded. Um, but it's hard for a parent to advocate for their student when they don't know exactly what their student needs. And it's such a trial and error, like finding what works and what doesn't work. It's exhausting, it's hard, but parents are more than willing to put in work, and schools need to understand that from a parental perspective, that it's difficult, it's time consuming, and it's exhausting. Like, schools understand this and they try. That's why they try so hard with evaluations, trying to find what works and what doesn't work for these children, and hoping that these teachers take these observations, okay, is this working for the child? Is it not working for the child? Is it being taken seriously? So, yeah, this was a lot of information, I know, but I think it was important. I have seen this in my own personal experience with my brother, as I've stated, that I've seen my parents fight for accessibility. I've even fought for accessibility as I've gotten older, and now that I'm in the educated field, I understand. And so sometimes I go to my brother's IEP meetings and I'm like, this is not working. My brother and I have talked about it. I see it in his school progression. It's not working for him. I think that this thing that I have found might work out better in terms of like accommodations of what he needs. Even devices he's using, they're not helpful in some classes. They're helpful in others, but not this one. And it's just a back and forth with the school, with the child study team, with the state. It's so much, but it's so worth it because it helps my brother get what he needs. So I understand. From an educator's perspective, in the brief periods that I've been in classrooms, it's a lot. It is. But you want the best for your students. You want your students to succeed. So these laws and policies, having an understanding of what they are, is so incredibly important as an educator. Even if you're not in special education, even if you're just in like general education, it's important to learn so you can help and advocate for your students. It's exhausting, I know, but think about how much your student will succeed later down the line if you start at an early age, or if you even capture it at a later age. See how much of a difference it's going to make. Your child, like that student, is going to have such a boost in self-esteem. It gives individuality, it gives an ego boost, it gives a confidence boost. The student feels like they can advocate for themselves. It's so important as an educator to see these students grow and become like confident human beings. So yeah, that is episode 1. I am so glad you've listened, and I think it's important to have an understanding of the impact of assistive technology in the field of education. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.